And so since the petition, I was asked to come and speak to the first historical hearing on the legal aspects of climate change and human rights, with my legal team, of course, who were there with me as I testified to the human aspects of all of this. But perhaps more importantly, I think, as we made some history at that time, was that the United States had begun to listen. And because the citizens of America, of course, were well ahead of their own government, and I'm sensing that in our own country this is happening as well, and that's a really hopeful sign. And the year that I launched the petition, in fact, I had more speaking invitations from the United States than I did anywhere else in the world at the time. Because again, as I say, the universities, the law schools, the events that were happening down there related to climate change were all citizen-driven, and they really wanted to do the right thing. And I think we did help to influence. Not that we were the only ones. There had been a momentum building already, but I think there was a real shift in the public debate on climate change, and I know that globally we helped to change the language and the discourse on this issue of climate change, and changing it from a very technical, political, economic issue to one with a human dimension to it. Because oftentimes I would go to a lot of these meetings globally around the world and realize that there was absolutely no heartbeat to these sessions. And so it was really important to put the human face, the human dimension, and of course, make sure that people understood that this was a human rights issue. So now we see not only Americans, but Canadians and citizens around the world are demanding change, and I know that within the next administration down there, certainly change will come. And I think also our message has resonated around the world as well, because just in April, we were able to, or we heard and we read that the United States, the United Nations, Human Rights Council has recognized climate change as a human rights issue, not only for Inuit of the Arctic, but for all Indigenous peoples and vulnerable peoples of the world. Because we know that it is the vulnerable, the poor, and the Indigenous peoples who are most marginalized, who will be most negatively impacted because they do not have the sophisticated mechanisms to deal with the rapid changes that are coming their way. So I see two roles in this global challenge for traditional knowledge, roles in which I hope that all of you will also play. First, we must do all that we can to lend the voices of Indigenous peoples and vulnerable communities around the world. I introduce you to my grandson. And the human faces of climate change, I think, is really important, because especially to the negotiations for the successor agreement to the Kyoto Protocol that began last December at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bali. And I think this treaty offers the best chance for us to come together to reduce and eliminate greenhouse gas emissions before the changes go beyond our control. And the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process, as I say, is often overrun by the highly technical and legal debate. And I've seen how delegations and nations can lose sight of the people around the world whose lives and cultures will forever be altered if we fail to act. And so we launched that petition for that reason, I think, to give the UNFCCC a heartbeat, a real sense of urgency, because really, as I say, it can become extremely bogged down in so many issue areas which really don't deal with the human aspect and the human impacts. And so much more efforts are needed to ensure that this fragile process is not derailed by narrow interests and overly technical debates. And traditional knowledge, our traditional knowledge's second role in this process relates to the first, in fact, and the amounts to the perpetual role of those in the Arctic and all regions most impacted by climate change as the best and closest observers of the changing environment. And as our world addresses this great challenge, I think it will be the Arctic that indicates the success of our collective efforts. I mean, we are the most negative, disproportionately impacted with the warming of the planet because of our complete reliance and dependence on the cold, the ice, and the snow for our hunting culture to survive. And there's no doubt that there are many other places, of course, as we melt, and Dr. Hassan will speak to that. As the Arctic melts and the Greenland melts, there are other places in the world that are sinking, and we know that in the small island developing states and beyond. So I think as our world addresses this great challenge, we need to come together. There are programs here in place in Canada alone, such as the Arctic Net. Some of you may already be involved in some of that process or know of it, which is an excellent step in that direction in those efforts. A program that brings together traditional knowledge holders and researchers and managers at every level and deals with the studying, not only the studying and the research, but the monitoring of climate change across our northern coast. And we need much more efforts to monitor the changes and hopefully one day to serve as a measure of that success of the global efforts to reduce climate change. And I think now even more so, as we hear again almost every day now, many, many reports coming around the world, there is such a rush now to claim the riches of the Arctic resources, and all the more we need to exercise wisdom and balance as we move ahead in this. So finally, let me just end by saying that climate change certainly challenges our simple-minded notion that unrestrained economic growth will always lead to a better world. It doesn't always, and we've learned that through the process and what is happening now, and as we witness all of these dramatic changes that are having such negative impacts on small communities, vulnerable communities. I think it does show how precious little time remains for us to recenter development on humanity and not just industry before we fundamentally change our world for the worse, particularly, once again, for those who contribute the least to the problem but have the most to lose. So for me, again, at this audience and many others around the world, I always say we have to work together, and in particularly in such an important venue such as this, on science issues, on people coming together. Let's try to do that and bring these issues to common ground with one another on this daunting task, because we're not only sharing this very challenged atmosphere globally, but we are a shared humanity after all, and if we can come together as that, we have a fighting chance at getting this right and not having to have this whole crisis unfold before our eyes and really act on it as quickly as we possibly can as a common humanity and shared humanity. So thank you again, Leslie, for having me speak to you here today, and I commend all of you for getting together and doing all of this hard work on everybody's behalf. So, nakomi Mariela, thank you.